Afternoon session of Risks and Trends 2020 conference for a panel in which we were asked the question whether it's time to get used to instability worldwide, in Europe, and of course in the region that interests us most. We will cover transatlantic relations, we will cover the rise of China, we will cover instabilities of different kind in Europe, and we will think about issues beyond the headlines. And I guess we have a very good group of assets, so to speak, among us to discuss that issue. Professor Danuta Hübner, who is the Polish link in Europe, for as far as I can remember. She used to be Polish commissioner. She's the member of the European Parliament for 2 terms now. We have someone who links the United States and Europe as well amongst us, Suda David-Wilp, who came to us from Berlin. She is the Deputy Director of German Marshall Fund office there. But actually she comes from the United States primarily, and she will tell us about the impact of instabilities on US-European relations. We have also someone who covers European, worldwide, Asian relations, Alicia Garcia Herrero, who is an academic. She's a professor of economy, but also she sits on boards of numerous financial institutions. Thank you very much for joining us. And last but not least, we have someone who has been correspondent for British media across, I should say, half of Europe. Tony Barber. He writes columns and opinions about European politics and economy. My name is Marek Swierczyński. I am security and defense analyst at Polityka Insight. Although I mentioned that we will probably need to back a little bit down from the headlines, the everyday news that consumes us, that adds to the feeling of instability, it is really hard not to begin with the dimension of instability that happened just a few days ago. That is, of course, Brexit. And I'm very happy that Professor Hübner has just returned from her visit to London, and she has a very fresh view on what has actually happened and what will be the long-term repercussions of Great Britain leaving the European Union. Professor Hübner.
I'm not sure I'm going to respond to your question. Certainly my view is not fresh because I've been involved in Brexit basically even before the Brexit at the end of 2015, when Mr. Cameron has already launched this first negotiation of this first deal that he got on free movement of people in February 2016. So I was already there with my hands more or less on, so I think I am unable probably to have a fresh view on Brexit. But I also would like to, before I say anything, I would like just to reveal to you honestly that I am a very hard Remainer, who's not a Brit and did not vote, can be. And as a European in Brussels, we had this Brussels speak that we always, anything that we say on Brexit, we have been starting for the last year with this saying, we regret but we respect the decision of the people. I've been always, till probably last elections in December, I've been always adding to this sentence my own sentence, which was that I was always hoping that somebody will call from London and will call it all off. But it didn't happen, so but I'm not yet a returner, as some people already think. But I think you are right that actually Brexit is, I think, a perfect example of a political process with actually huge potential of instability. And I think that it comes from, or what I'm saying, it comes from my understanding of the characteristics of this political process, which is definitely uncertainty due to many factors, but which is also unpredictability. And I think it refers both to the first phase. We have been working in those conditions for nearly 4 years now. And I think also it refers to what is still ahead of us, which might be another cliff edge, potential cliff edge. But I think that what is important when one thinks why this political instability is so strong in case of Brexit, it's because it's not only that Brexit has impact or affects those sort of global things or at national level. Brexit actually from the very beginning has been extremely important and affected to various extent individuals, citizens, their life choices, and also if you think of businesses, they were also, one can say, entire financial sector, entire car industry. But I think there are everywhere individual business people. There are individuals, especially SMEs, and these are millions in Europe. So this fact that we have this micro level instability, I think, and the decisions have been made also at this level, that adds to the entire instability, I think, of Brexit. But then I also think that the way it was handled from the point of view of democratic legitimacy and accountability, you might remember that actually it was just the government issue for quite a while till Ms. Miller just wrote to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court said, no, Parliament has to be also involved. I remember this day when it happened. So from my point of view, it's just unbelievable that you can plan to do such a thing and think that you can do it at a government level. And then, I don't know if you remember when it was when for the first time Mrs. Theresa May met Mr. Corbyn on Brexit. So it was only the ruling party, if I can say it this way, issue, and the opposition has not been involved, has not been consulted. It was a year ago in February or March, I don't remember exactly, when the first meeting with the opposition took place. And that was an occasion of second vote or whatever, which was so I think also this issue was extremely important. And then also I think because we usually, institutions have problem with transparency, especially when it comes to issues like when you negotiate, when you have things you as politician, you think they are very important for you. And Barnier started actually on the EU side this narrative about the need to be very transparent on this process. And on the EU side, I can tell you as an old European, because as commissioner, since 2004 I was there in Brussels, I've been there, and we never had such a transparent process. I remember when we negotiated TTIP, how different it was. And so we had a full transparency, and I think that was much less on the British side. It was much more difficult, and I think there was not enough I would say there was limited transparency on the British side, definitely.
So
and
in a way, it was an attempt from the European Union to contain the level of disruption by applying such a process.
Yeah. And then there was this second issue, in addition to predictability and uncertainty, there was also this question of legal certainty that had to be given. In our view, we needed to try from the very beginning, ensure that legal certainty for all those affected will be created during the withdrawal process. And that's why the whole negotiation of withdrawal agreement, and the very withdrawal agreement is actually a legal document that is providing this legal certainty to the citizens, to the businesses, to all of us also as institutions or as sort of important representatives also of the future fate of for what we are responsible. And on our side, that's why we were insisting so much on backstop, because we were not sure that we will get in the future negotiation the agreement on the Irish border that would allow allow us to avoid what was our obsession on both sides. I think the hard border and this all-island economy, and also respect of the integrity of the single market. That's why we were absolutely sort of obsessed with this backstop, to have just in case if there is no agreement. So that also, I think, was an element to that was showing that we saw this uncertainty and unpredictability in the whole process. And the last thing on this issue, just to finish, let me finish, is just also we managed, which was again unprecedented on the EU side, we managed to keep unity among the 27, let's call it, member states. I don't remember such a process where there was, I know why we had it, but it probably would be too cynical to say it loudly, but we managed to get it. So there was also reaction to the potential risks that we saw for this process in the future.
So in your view, the European Union proved very efficient in the attempt to mitigate, to limit the level of disruption by applying the processes, by drawing some red lines?
No, I don't know if we proved efficient. I would say there was the whole paradox of this process, that the success of this process is measured by something which we wanted not to have, which is we were efficient in finding, so in making Brexit happen, actually. Of course, the second level target was to have it really in an orderly manner, so to have the agreement. And some colleagues did not understand it, I think, in the European Parliament when they voted against the consent. When the consent was, this is a unilateral process, so the only thing that we could vote was that we agree on this, to have it on the basis of agreement. But Brits could leave the day after without anything. And so that's why I think we were not asked whether we want Brexit or not, but we knew that if Brexit has to take place, it must be at least what is our responsibility. It must be done on the basis of an agreement which we negotiated.
Professor Hübner, I will get back to you very soon with the question of the long-term consequences. But I would like to add some other dimension to our discussion, because many of us in Europe start to think that Brexit created a process that can lead to decomposition, not only to disruption, but also to decomposition of the institutions that we live in. And again, many of us think, if you're asking who is the main decomposer of the order of the world that we live in, many of us would answer the question with the two words, Donald Trump. And this is my question to Suda. Donald Trump has applauded Brexit in many ways and forms. Does that will that have influence on his relations with the European Union, with Britain as a separate country within Europe, but not within the European institutions, once he's elected, once he's re-elected? And you know, a lot indications are that he will.
So thank you for having me here today, Marek. Yes, of course. I mean, it was a surprise to see President Trump basically cheering on the process of Brexit when you saw previous to that in the other administration, President Obama actually imploring the Brits to stay in. So that juxtaposition was very stark, of course. But, you know, I think that it's clear from what we've heard from Donald Trump and maybe even others in the White House that there is sort of a lack of respect for the European Union and what it stands for, even though it was actually buttressed from, you know, support from the United States. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton also recently sent out a tweet applauding the British for its new path. So absolutely, Donald Trump, I think, prides himself on being a disruptor, but this disruption has, of course, thrown the so-called liberal international order upside down. And in a country like Germany and Berlin, where I sit, this is, some would say, an existential situation for a country like Germany, because it threatens the open trading system that Germany relies on, the security guarantee, and of course, an inclination towards working together with other countries, multilateralism, when we saw President Trump pulling out of these multilateral agreements, whether it be the climate accord in Paris or the JCPOA.
From your experience in the Capitol Hill, do you feel that there might be a strategy in this disruptive behavior?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. When you talk to Republican members of Congress, which I do quite often, most of them are not particularly fans of President Trump, the way he behaves or his style, but they will always tell you that the policies, they agree with the policies. And they'll also say that if you look at the other side, of course, you know, we need to support what the White House does. So, I mean, I guess the strategy is to embrace the disruption, because at the same time, policies like tax cuts go through, or some even applaud the move to Jerusalem with the U.S. Embassy. So there are things that the Republicans, conservative judges, that outweigh perhaps the chaos for the international order that we see here in Europe, that they applaud.
Okay, Alicia, I would like to ask you, using your knowledge of Asian culture, institutions, and the way to do business, how is the European instability and how is the US unpredictability perceived in Asia?
Well, I've been living in Hong Kong for many years, and I've gotten used to this very famous phrase in China, which is everything is about stability. Yeah, one thing, that's what Chinese people want. Rightly so, after a very difficult history, and you know, when they look at Brexit, I still remember we were writing a report at the time, right before the day before the Brexit referendum. We were sitting with our Chinese colleagues in Brussels, writing this report on EU-China relations, and they just couldn't believe that that referendum would ever even happen, and it's going to happen the day after. So you know, you can't stop it, but how can you put something as important at risk? So for them, the fact that we're going through this is kind of, how would you even dare put it up front? Meaning, how would you even conceive it, because it's so risky? So, you know, first of all, their approach to risk, and you know, same with Trump, or, you know, how can Trump be there? How can Brexit ever happen? Is one of amazement. I mean, why do you expose yourself? But the reality, and this is where I want to come to, is that they are as risky as we are, even if they hate that concept. And it's not only about the coronavirus. I'm not going to start on that front, but, you know, coming from Hong Kong and being stopped already, you can't even fly to Manila from Hong Kong, you know, because of this. It does show that instability can come from anywhere, no matter how much you hate it. And what I've learned after years living in a place without any democracy, you know, Hong Kong, stable, China, stable, is that when you're stable, when it hits damn big. Because you fear that instability. So in a way, I mean, my lesson of Brexit or, you know, Trump is that, yeah, it looks scary, but somebody wanted it, yeah? Somebody chose it, so it's like, it's difficult, but what I'm really scared to death now living in Hong Kong is what happens when you hate that instability and you start having it, which is what we see in China today.
You mean the coronavirus?
But it's not only the coronavirus. It's China's reaction to the trade war. It's China's structural deceleration. And what's happening to the region is China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm not going to, you know, get into this is China's fault or anything like that. What I'm saying is that when you believe in instability, and the world is as we describe it, and we have stuff like Brexit or Trump, it's very hard for you to keep that instability within your borders, let alone the fact that, you know, there are things happening within your borders anyway. So it's not only coming from Trump, it's not only coming from Brexit. So in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that Asia is probably not ready for instability, and that makes it even more vulnerable than we are in a way, because they just can't stand it. And that's for us a big message here, because we think, you know, we're in the doldrums, and, you know, but actually they see our doldrums, they understand our doldrums. We don't understand theirs. So it's a big focus on instability for us that we're not yet even taking into account. We're talking about Brexit, which is great, about Trump. But I think what's coming from China is really humongous for this part of the world.
I would like to reverse my question to you a little bit, using your second half European and financial experience. Because China, of course, in parts of Europe, in parts of United States, or maybe all United States, is perceived as a disruptor as well.
Yeah.
How do the financial institutions see it?
Well, financial institutions have seen China as an opportunity for a long time. It so happens that we were never given the full opportunity because the market was closed, or at least financial opening for China. I used to work for a bank which was invested in the 5 largest bank in China, CITIC Bank. They got all the way to 15%. You could go all the way to 20%. That was the limit. But the reality is that you never knew what was happening in the actual institution you were invested in. So in other words, Western financial institutions for a long time tried to be part of that boom. But once they enter, and this is early 2000s, they realized they couldn't control the process and that those big profits they thought they would make wouldn't be there. First, because they didn't control the process, it was very risky. And then because of the 2008 boom and bust of credit in China, the actual revenues that Chinese banks make are not as apparent as we thought they were. So people retrenched, foreign banks retrenched. Now the market is starting to get more open because the Chinese need investment, especially in the banking sector. There's a lot of hidden NPLs, but foreign banks are not so willing to come in. The reason is that first, capital requirements now are humongous after the global financial crisis. It's much more expensive, basically, to get enough capital to get into China. Second, the prospects are so much worse for anybody. So, the investment versus the return has really changed since the early 2000s for the worse for foreign institutions, even if China is opening up. But that there's not full market access, there's no reciprocity, and the prospects are worse. So that's why there isn't such thing as a big bank announcing, I'm getting full win in China.
So in these terms, more instability ahead.
Yes, and we see the instability as well. And we see also, the uncertainty in terms of, the lack of transparency. We see what may have happened to some Canadian out there, let alone a British, let alone a Swedish. Those were booksellers, but the Canadians weren't booksellers. So, there's a lot of very, very intense both reputational and staff risk involved in operating in China that many financial institutions, and not only financial institutions, don't want to take. And that's why even if China tries to open, it's not as appealing as it was when it was supposedly opening after the entry into the WTO, which wasn't a full opening, as I tried to explain.
Could I just do a horrible thing? Tony will forgive me. I have to leave in 5 minutes because I have a plane which I cannot just do anything. And I still would like to say a few sentences and to hook on something to what you said and then I go, okay? Because you said that when you talked about the risk, that it's just somebody's choice. And I think it's extremely important to remember that the Brexit actually was not a necessity. It was a political choice which was made and which divided people. So I think when you think about the future just on this 2 minutes, I think we will have probably to look also at what can happen in UK. I don't think that we are done with the debate. I mean, there are people who said we lost. So the existential sort of questions will continue to pop up, and I think in the years to come, this issue will be, discussed because the divisions will stay. And then also we don't know what can happen, whether sort of constitutional crisis will sort of emerge or not. But what I think is important is how we, the European Union now, will behave and what we will be able to do. And just when I think we will probably start the negotiations at the beginning of March or maybe very end of February, and I think we have to be prepared as European Union to have a very bespoke agreement agreement. I think it is a third country as of today's, but it's not just one of the third countries. It's around the corner, it's a huge market, it's interconnected, it's nearly fully aligned with our rules and procedures also. So how far, the question for European Union will be how far we can go towards having a sort of special partnership with UK, unprecedented, that we have not offered to anybody, and we have to find a way, and hopefully there will be a positive reaction from the UK side, but we have to find a way to do it. And for the time being, what we hear is still the language of war and the language of divergence and the language of taking control back, even today from UK. So maybe, and that's my hope, that maybe Europe will be going back to this idea of having, we had those discussions like 3 or 4 years ago, to have a sort of different circles of friends around, and that we will have this first circle for countries, for states like UK, and that we will be able to build really a very close relationship. But that would require a very comprehensive and deep, but that would require a lot of change from Boris Johnson, from that government, to go beyond this narrative which we hear all the time there. And I think Boris Johnson does what he wants, as we see as politicians, in a very effective way. So I still hope that he will understand that he doesn't have this sort of perfect choice between Atlantic and Channel link, that Atlantic is going to be important for all of us, pain in the head, but still important, but we have to use the channel still to create this very close relationship. I think that's the only way to go to reduce the instability, to increase also the sort of benefits of being together and having this ex-member states relationship that can be done. But of course, EU has to protect 440 million people, so we will have a very clear also red lines, not only the
Just
UK.
very briefly before you go, do you think that the European Union has learned how to contain the next potential disruptive crisis?
Well, I personally remember that 4 years ago we had this domino effect, all those visions and who will be next, and that's how Polexit was sort of, this construct was also invented, I think. Then we also had at that time Salvini getting Italy out of EU and Eurozone, Madame Le Pen, the same. These narratives have disappeared completely, and then I think that Brexit has been a lesson of that I don't think anybody would like to repeat. So now the challenge for us is to use also this also unprecedented process of this 2-year conference. It's a horrible name, Conference on the Future of Europe, but it's just a 2-year process which will be hopefully well structured and will bring, will go beyond the Brussels elites and will bring people to have a joint discussion and decisions on the future of Europe. So that's also our chance. But I think it would be absolutely, I think, a huge mistake on our side if we did not try to keep UK, of course, as we say, as close as possible, but just beyond what is on average for the third countries relationship the Union has.
Professor Hübner, thank you very much for your time with us. Tony Barber, you've been reporting from places much more unstable, much more unpredictable, much more dangerous, in fact, throughout your journalistic career. Are we perhaps overreacting nowadays to whatever happens across the world?
There's always a risk of overreacting, but I do think that events of the last 5 to 10 years show that something quite fundamental is changing in the world order, and that is there are more serious threats to multilateralism than there have been at any time for 75 years. And this applies across the board, not just to the world trading system, but to arms control, climate change, lots of areas where you would hope to see international cooperation. It's being replaced by a more kind of muscular nationalism that I think is a reflection of the decline of a bipolar world. You know, you have apart from the US and China, at the sort of next level, you have a number of large countries, all of kind of similar rank, and in each you have a kind of politics of militant national identity. You see it in India, you see it in Turkey, Brazil. You see it everywhere really, but not so much in the countries of the European Union. But these changes that I'm describing of the last 5 to 10 years represent a particular threat to the European Union, because it is an organization that more than any other part of the world really, with the possible exception of places like Japan and Canada, really does need multilateralism to flourish and remain stable. So no, I don't think we're exaggerating when we say that these are threats. And I would add that the continental European response to events like Brexit risks being a bit too over defensive, as it were. The conventional view is everyone is going to lose from this. You know, we, the EU, are going to lose, the British are going to lose, it's just terrible. But we are where we are, and we've got to make, you know, the best of where we are. And that I think means, if I realise it's hardly appropriate for me to tell the EU 27 what to do, but nevertheless, the idea that a relative British success out of Brexit would be something threatening, I think this would be a mistake. A better approach would be to say, look, we'd like to see you do well, and you in return, you know, you applaud us when we do well, and that way you might get the cooperative spirit that Danuta was talking about.
I'm glad that you've expanded the list of disruptors to other places in the world and other leaders, because you can get the impression that, you know, it's a strategy of choice. I was asking Sudaf whether there is a strategy in Trump's behavior, but you can see worldwide that there are leaders who are choosing to behave in a disruptive way in order to jump into higher league, if you like, to expand their power, to pursue their policies.
Yes, as I say, one sees it really in all continents at the moment. It raises the question for the European Union of whether its credibility is in any way endangered by its ability to cope with this new type of politics around its borders. And there are obviously question marks there about how effective the EU is. I mean, in relation to, for example, Turkey, where, you know, over the last 20 years, an ever greater distance has emerged in relation to the area we now call the Western Balkans. But there, you know, it's far from clear that there's a coherent position producing results there from the EU. And then there's Russia also. So you've got the kind of East, Southeast and South North Africa. And the risk now that the English-speaking world on the edge of the Atlantic and beyond, on the Western Atlantic, you know, the United States, and that this is now no longer a kind of core part of the Western alliance, but actually an area that's becoming increasingly critical.
So it looks like, you know, Europe, Western Europe at least, is an island surrounded by areas of unpredictability and instability, and a country which advocates very strongly towards keeping this old order, multilateralism, and the rules of international law, is Germany. So the question to you, Sudha, how is Europe coping, and will it actually? What can it do?
Sure. I mean, and I think Tony's right, and I'd like to take that analogy of Brexit and expand it toward the transatlantic relationship, because I think Europeans should or will come to a point and realize that there is not going to be a status quo ante. We're not going to go back to what was once. And it's now, as Merkel said in her campaign speech in a beer tent, Europeans have to take, or Germans have to take fate in their own hands. And I think the point is to craft a position where Europe can also make a name for itself. It's not going to necessarily play in the same league as the United States and China, but certainly it is a credible partner for the United States. There are still people, and even in Congress, Republicans will tell you that the transatlantic partnership is very important. So one shouldn't also just cast the whole relationship with the White House in mind. There are other power centers in the United States as well. But as I said before, we're not going to return to what once was. So I think it is a matter of Europe taking the reins and trying to become a credible power. And unfortunately, there is a bit of a leadership vacuum as well. And the question is, I sit in Berlin and talked about this with my colleagues before here in our Warsaw office. We really don't know if Germany is necessarily going to make any move until the next election. So that is an issue. There is a lack of leadership.
Well, we have an emerging leader in Europe, actually, today in Warsaw, President Emmanuel Macron. Yeah. Do you think that the Macron's way of leading Europe is the way forward?
I'm not going to necessarily give my personal opinion on how European leadership style should be, but I do think that Americans want Europeans to also, work in tandem and not necessarily say, well, no, we can't do that, or that's not right. But okay, well, so what is the right response? I think that's something that's not necessarily the situation now with President Trump, but you've seen that in the past as well, where Europeans sort of wait for the Americans to take the lead or, give the direction. But I think it's now going to be time when Europeans somehow also set the tone and decide what they should move on. And there are a number of issues like climate change, I think, where Americans can learn from what the Europeans are doing. You are front and center out on that. So, or privacy, for example. We're living in a digital world. You talk about dramatic change. The Europeans were trailblazers when it comes to privacy and living in a digital world. I think Americans now look back and say, wow, maybe there was something back then when the Europeans were being so sensitive about data privacy.
What is the Asian view on the inability of Europe as a whole to act as a whole?
So I can share with you the Asian view, which wouldn't be too different from what I heard from you both, but I'm continental European, and I have to say something now pretty contrarian to what I've heard, which is that I'm not sure I want a leader like the ones you both have. And this is what I think lies behind Europeans' dislike about leadership. I mean, is it such a great thing to have such leaders? Why would a different approach to leadership, which is much less, basically consensus-based, which is what Europe has had for many years, which has basically, put the ground there for us never to speak about war anymore, which is already a big theme for us, be such a bad thing. I mean, I live in a place where there is a strong leader, China. Hong Kong is China today. I dislike that leadership, okay? And I quite dislike others, as I mentioned. So I think banking on Europe, literally on a daily basis, for their lack of leadership or our lack of leadership is something that I think needs to be reflected upon. And this is only true if eventually we give up to the leadership we see in Turkey, the leadership we see in Russia. But I don't want to give up. I don't want to be a clone of that leadership. I don't want Europe to look like that. Actually, I would rather like to hear that Europe has a model, basically based on consensus, that it's a pity it's lacking elsewhere, meaning if I put multilateralism in the European context, that's what we have. Yeah, we're a multilateral or multinational endeavor, which happens to, share currency and many other things, and a single market. And by the way, when we say that, Trump doesn't like Europe now, I've seen that before. I used to work for the European Central Bank, and it was just mind-boggling at the start of the euro. Okay, so this was a time, 98, when everything we heard from the US that it was an impossible project. So it's not new. And so what I'm trying to say is that I in my humble opinion, there's been a long-standing push for Europe not to get united. And yes, we aren't united, but I'm saying I'd rather have what we have now than the leadership I see around. This is my my continental European view of Europe from Asia. What I see in Asia is not any better, no matter whether they happen to be the other hegemon, not something I would like Europe to go for. I'd rather have my privacy, my Green Deal, our democratic regimes, and a much better income distribution than either China or the US.
Yeah, so can I just jump in here for a second?
Yes.
I mean, leadership can be interpreted in many ways, and I think when I talk about leadership, I think you definitely need an instigator, a positive force to get your ducks in a row. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not saying, Europe needs a strong man or a strong woman. I'm saying that at some point you have to have a conductor lead the band, and that's what's missing in Europe. And you're absolutely right. I think in the United States there was always some, Europe muddles through. We've heard that in the Obama administration and other administrations. But at the end of the day, most Americans and most, the post-World War II consensus is that a strong Europe is good for the United States. I agree with you. For the first time, we are witnessing a White House that sees things differently. But that is not across the board in the United States. As I mentioned before, many Republican members of Congress believe in a strong NATO, want to have a good trading relationship with Europe. So I don't think that you can generalize and say that the U.S. over the years has been against Europe. The United States was a key, helped with the genesis of the European Union.
Okay, can I say something? Sure. Europe's with the UK, Europe's GDP today is as big as China or the US. It's about 18 trillion US dollar. And I actually think that the US, once upon a time, as it happened with Japan, a much smaller economy today, but which actually reached in dollar terms, not in purchasing power, but in dollar terms, the US size in the 80s, late 80s. I actually think that in the same way Japan was a threat for the US, Europe was a threat for the US too, once upon a time. And once upon a time, and maybe even until very recently. And a very strong Europe, which happens to be supposedly what the US has been looking for a long time, very strong Europe, imagine a Europe, a nation. Imagine a nation with a strong president of the likes of some that we may not like today. I'm not sure that would be as welcome. I think the US has always wanted a Europe that depended militarily on the US, which aligned with the US in the same way as Japan. Okay? Now, that's fine. We're there. We don't have strong leadership, maybe, rightly so, given the conception of what Europe had to be since the Second World War. I'm just saying that on that basis, we didn't do so badly because we managed to get a single market, we managed to get a single currency. It's not perfect. We don't agree on many things. But on the basis of what I see for other countries that actually went that way, strong leadership, China being one, which didn't adapt to what the US probably was expecting from China, I'm still feeling, okay, it could have been worse. That's all I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Because although it may look wonderful on the surface, it isn't for those living there. I mean, I just have this very strong opinion living in even Hong Kong, the same thing, that Europeans, we have, from data privacy, from caring from environment,
Sure,
from
that's
democracy.
That's what I
So,
said.
so in a way, yes, we don't have strong leaders, but we have so many other things. That's all I'm saying.
But,
Yeah.
but everything you mentioned, the data privacy, the protection of the European way of life, in a way, comes from the institutions that Tony reminded us are 70 plus years old, basically, in terms of the order of the world after Second World War. My question to you is, do you think that these institutions and this world order can accommodate the rise of China?
Well, of course not, because we're already, I mean, had you asked me that question 10 years ago, maybe I would have had doubts. But as of today, we already see that we can't accommodate the rise of China in that order we had. I think part of the reason why the US is pushing against multilateralism is a response to China. It's not a response to us necessarily, it's a response to China, which affects Europe. But I think the most important reason for the US to do so is this massive bloc which doesn't play with those rules that we thought were working for the world as a whole. So in that regard, the answer already is no. Now, what do we do? What do we do about it? Now,
Exactly.
Now that we know that a country like China, and I don't think it's only China, I mean, Tony's point on Turkey or Brazil or India, I think they're all very well taken, because when we talk about China, we think it's the regime, the Communist Party, the state ownership. I think you could have economies where that's not so apparent, but that still might not play by the rules of the game that we designed years ago, because they weren't really there. I mean, they didn't have the capacity to decide on those rules of the game, and they may wish, rightly so, to have their go, and in adapting those rules to their reality. So I don't think it's only China, but China is obviously much more important given its size, and a much more extreme economic model in the sense that a much more different economic model than what we have had so far within which we have created these rules that we now, or at least the US is trying to rewrite. Yeah.
Tony, do you think that in the 2020s we are on the verge of creating new world order, or will there be just more instability and more disruption ahead?
I don't think I'd go.
I mean, decomposition versus creating something new.
I can't myself imagine that a sort of coherent, stable world order would come about that quickly. In the next, you're talking about the next 10 years. I don't see that happening. No, I think that we've got to take account of the fact that the American view here, and it goes beyond the current White House. It's shared quite widely in both the parties, and to a large extent in the business world. The view is that China is a problem, and it's a problem because it doesn't play by the rules that everyone had got used to in the American view. And so if you're sitting in Washington, you say, well, we want our allies and other countries on our side in this confrontation with China. And I think that presents very awkward choices for the Europeans, including the British. Very awkward choices indeed, because at the end of the day, the Europeans still, and including the British, still depend on the Americans for their security. Yeah. So if they want that security, they might have to line up with Washington on this grand strategy approach towards China, and some might not want to, but it was a couple of years ago that Angela Merkel talked about, well, we're going to have to take on some more responsibility for ourselves, and actually here we are a couple of years later and nothing's happened. And it can't happen. It's very difficult, at least, very difficult for it to happen in the German context, because institutionally German democracy is just not geared to produce that kind of bigger strategic approach to foreign and security policy.
Sudha, is there a new world vision on the US side? And in Germany, is there anything else than just keeping the institutions that we have
I think
today?
the world vision in the United States is just what's the next headline. I mean, things are so rapid. We're very reactive. It's very hard to be proactive. But certainly there is, in Washington, if you go to the Pentagon, it's true. China is the systemic rival to the United States, Russia as well, when you talk about the national security strategy. But China is front and center. And I think really in this election year coming up, we're going to be concerned with nation building at home. That's what President Trump also promised the American people during his campaign. My personal opinion is something that I don't think he's delivered on that. But if the Democrats do take back the White House, that will be something that will also suck the energy of the White House, although they're going to have to rebuild partnerships with our allies in Europe and Asia. And a country like Germany, I agree with being squeezed in the middle between China and the United States. It's the debate about 5G, digital infrastructure, but also if you look at the backbone of German industry, the automotive industry, they rely on a revenue from China. So this is a country that also benefits immensely, existentially, from the security umbrella that the United States provides. And also there's a lot of emotional ties with the United States, but they're starting to realize that we are struck between a rock and a hard place. We want our economy to thrive, and that means having trading relationships with China, but we also have our traditional, most important foreign security pillar of the United States to contend with.
Mm-hmm. I guess Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has just, a few days ago designated the Chinese Communist Party as the central threat of our times. These are the words he used. How would that be seen in China?
Well, I mean, for me, one of the most amazing things about Chinese is that they love Trump. I mean, you may think that's crazy, but it is true.
So they would see it as a declaration of war.
I don't mean to say the State Council necessarily. I mean to say Chinese people. Why? For the reason you mentioned. Strong. The guy is strong. And as long as he's strong, we like it because it mimics what we want for our country. And that, of course, explains very well why their own country is heading towards more, stronger leadership and stronger, because that's what Chinese people think will bring them forward. Meaning, as a response to the threat, the U.S. being a threat. And if you look at what Chinese people actually study at school, I mean, this idea that they won't be allowed to rise and that, it's always there and it's always coming from the West. So in a way, I think they see Trump as, okay, that's what we were expecting. That's what we thought it should be. It's not hidden. It's at least clear, but it was always there. And in that regard, the interesting thing is that they're not surprised by those words. If anything, the surprise is that you say it so bluntly, because we already knew that you were coming after us. Because we are the strongest civilization on Earth, and rightly so, you should come after us. So, it's a very interesting, which is very different for Europeans. We feel threatened, but Chinese just feel he's just saying, well, we knew already. It doesn't change at all. What it changes, though, is that now that it is crystal clear, they need to do something about it, even more than they would have done had it been crystal clear. And that explains their reaction and their speed at basically looking for allies, and 5G in the UK could be a very good example of this. I mean, trying to show the US that who is isolating whom. In other words, I'm doing my best to isolate you, and you are isolating yourself because you're treating your allies in a way that we are actually happy about. So that's the thing. China is only pushing the accelerator by hearing Pompeo. That's all they're doing. Now, it so happens, though, that they have their own problems. If it were so easy, If they didn't have their problems, they could push the accelerator, Belt and Road Initiative, 17+1, you name it, yeah? I mean, basically throwing cash everywhere, which they have been doing until recently, but increasingly less so. Since 2018, you know, I mean, the situation, trade war, and also structural deceleration in China is such that it's not so obvious anymore whether they can actually make it. Make it meaning have enough support to confront the US. That's the key question. And the more we see, you know, Hong Kong, a very obvious example of response, in a way, negative response from the Hong Kong people or some Hong Kong people. Now the coronavirus. I mean, this is a mind-bogglingly bad for China. We can't even imagine. I mean, think about Chinese not being able to travel anywhere. I mean, if we don't realize how they feel, but it's extremely negative for their own self confidence. And we're at the beginning of this shock, but this is a shock of confidence for Chinese about their own regime. This is a very big thing for China. Hong Kongers want to close the border. 80% of Hong Kongers want to close the border with China. But Hong Kong is China. I mean, think about it. It's so what I'm saying is, yes, the response was rush to confront the US. Now that rushing will be increasingly difficult for China because of their own crisis of trust. We're not yet there. Maybe I shouldn't say crisis of trust. We're not there, but I fear we'll get there because the situation is very, very difficult.
We have less than 15 minutes of our panel, so I would encourage the audience, if anyone wants to make a remark or ask a question to the panelists, please feel free to raise your hand and signal your willingness. I will let you speak in a moment. I would just like to add another dimension to our discussion, because we've been focusing on China, on Trump, on Brexit. Very rarely did we speak about the closest disruptor, Mr. Putin. And Britain has a lot to say about his disruption lately. And actually, Britain, even leaving the European Union, remains one of the strongest, if not the strongest, European voice, alarming the rest of the continent against Russia's disruptive behaviors.
Well, there are 2 points I would make about Putin and Russia here. One, I recall in the year 2007, so 13 years ago, after Putin gave his speech at the Munich Security Conference that really surprised and worried people, because it was very harsh criticisms being made of the US and the Western alliance. And some months after that, he appeared at a EU-Russia summit in Portugal. Portugal had the rotating presidency at that time, and I went to it. And Putin was a little bit milder in what he said, but at the end of the summit, I found myself sitting at a dinner with two diplomats, one from Portugal and the other from Estonia. And the Portuguese diplomat said to me, "Oh, this is terrible. Why are we letting our relations with Russia become so strained? You know, I mean, Russia, it's the country of Dostoevsky and Turgenev." And the Estonian was looking shocked. "What are you talking about, Dostoevsky? It's nothing to do with Dostoevsky. It's Russia. They're threatening." And you had two completely different points of view. And this is the problem in the European Union. It's 27, used to be 28 countries. And you have a country on the Atlantic coast like Portugal that genuinely does not feel any threat at all. In Italy, you have across the whole party spectrum from the hard right, the Lega, through the Cinque Stelle and anti-establishment five-star movement, through to the centre-left. They're all want to be more friendly with Russia. But then you get to Poland, the Baltic states, Sweden, Finland, and the attitude is, you know what, this is a real problem. And it's very, very difficult to get a single coherent position out of all that. So that is a problem for for Europe, and I don't see it changing. The second point I would make relates to the position of Russia in this bigger US-Chinese competition. You know, what would happen if the Americans were to say to the Europeans, you know what, we feel that things have got so serious, we need to find some accommodation with Russia, because the Chinese problem is so big, we've got to have Russia closer to it. Now, if that came at a cost, if the price was, who knows, something over Ukraine, for example, you know. I mean, that would be a very, very, very difficult thing for a lot of EU governments to solve, particularly neighbours of Ukraine, not Poland. Maybe it won't ever come to that, but I do think we should keep in mind that, you know, Russia is not the kind of equivalent of China. As the Americans rightly see it, the long-term issue is China, and if you want to bring people on your side, it's not. I don't think it would happen in the era of Putin, probably, but at some point in the future it could do, and then that it's a bit like Macron talking about, you know, we need expanded dialogue with Russia. It's hard.
Any reactions to this?
Well, I would say that we don't know the direction or the trajectory of the Republican Party. I think there is also bipartisan agreement that Russia meddled in the election, but that's not to say that we have our own issues of polarization, and Russia took advantage of fertile ground. So that could be the case, but I think it's more of like maybe there'll be some sort of transatlantic bargain that the United States says, Europe, please do more in your neighborhood, whether it's Northern Africa or Russia, security with Russia, while we take on the heavy lifting in the Asia-Pacific region when it comes to China.
Yeah, I just want to add very quickly. I fully agree. I think the very strong Russia, I understand I'm in Poland, so I have to be careful, but the very strong Russia that you see as you move east in Europe, I mean, from my perspective in Asia, you just don't see that. You think this is an aging economy, very dependent on, of course, oil and gas. All of that gas is already in China's hands with a 400 billion contract that they need to comply with, over 100 billion in loans from the two policy banks in China. So for me, from my perspective, it's like Mephisto. I mean, Russia has already sold its soul to China. And that's where the power is. So for me, Europe actually, if you ask me, offers kind of a possibility to Russia to get maybe away from, you know, from the claws of China. That's the way I see it from that perspective. And that's why I understand Macron's vision. But again, this is not today. This might be in 5 years, in 10 years. And within that time, there may be some prey, you know, that Russia can get out of our fear that, you know, maybe rightly or wrongly, history is very important. But I'm saying from the perspective of China, and I can give you the example of Venezuela, I mean, 60 billion is Chinese loans. 6 billion is Russian loans. You look at Bloomberg, Russia is negotiating with Venezuela. Come on. Mm-hmm. Russia is there. As the Chinese call Russia, the dog that barks for them. Okay? That says it all about how they see the world. And I quite agree with them. Because, you know, at the end of the day, Russia is heavily indebted to China today. And that's not going to last forever without China really imposing a lot of policies on them.
Now we've got less than 5 minutes. I could see 2 hands here and none on the other side. So, Chris Bobinski, please. Is there a microphone here?
Sorry? Thank you very much. Just briefly, I wanted to pick up on what Alicia Herrero said about the virus being a big shock for China. Could it be China's Chernobyl, what Chernobyl meant for the Soviet Union? Could this be as big as that?
Can we take another questions here in the front? I guess the German ambassador.
Yeah, thank you very much for the interesting discussion. And I have one question and one comment. I asked the question first so that the person who the question is asked to can think about it. The question is to Tony Barber about the recent attitude and the recent speech by Boris Johnson on how he sees the negotiations with the European Union in the coming 12 months till the end of the... It's a very harsh rhetoric, if I interpret this correctly. At the same time, my colleagues here in Warsaw run around saying, yeah, Britain is leaving the European Union, but it's not leaving Europe. So how do you think, what will come out at the end of 12 months negotiations with the European Union? So that's the question. The other one is a comment on leadership. And here I agree with what Sudha has said. It all depends on how you define leadership. Of course, when you define it only in financial terms, and then everybody will say, oh, Germany is not paying enough for defense. But then you can say in the last 5 years, we've increased our spending for 40%. If you talk about structures, we have to say that certain things are not going into the right direction in the European Union. So we have to discuss structures. We have to discuss about majority voting. Can we increase the subjects on which we vote on certain things? And the other thing is, let's not forget the political activity. I mean, who is leading on climate, the Green Deal? It's the European Union, yeah? Who is leading on Iran, JCPOA, etc.? It's the E3, it's Europe. Who is leading also on the eastern flank? We've been able to do a lot more than everybody suspected a couple of years ago. So we are advancing on this issue. Who is leading on Ukraine? Yeah, the European Union, the Normandy force is leading on this one. So and China, I think also there's a debate. Obviously, I mean, on the one hand, in the U.S. This is very clear. This is the peer competitor of the 21st century. So you have to be very clear on what you do. We in Europe have a different attitude. We think it may be that way, but there may be other ways to get to go there as well. We may increase. We have possibilities of hedging against that. So I think the picture is quite mixed, and one should not condemn Europe for lack of leadership because others are destroying or trying to destroy this kind of leadership. Thank you.
And we will take the last contribution if there is one. If there isn't, who would like to begin with answering a question? Alicia, maybe.
Well, I couldn't hear very well, but I know there's no time to repeat the question, so I'll take it offline. But I heard something about Soviet Union, so I guess it's like a little bit...
It was Chernobyl.
Sorry? It's like?
Is the virus...
like Chernobyl, no.
Chernobyl, yeah.
I don't think you mean the coronavirus?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's different than Chernobyl because there is contagion, you know? I mean, like, it's very different because you can export Chernobyl, which you couldn't do in Chernobyl. So in other words, I mean, let me very briefly what I think about coronavirus. Coronavirus is, first of all, shows what one man only power regime can do to lack of transparency, only increase it, and thus create issues. But what it also shows is that the US is ready, sorry to say, to use any means possible to contain China. Because the US was, if not the first, among the first, I believe the first, to block Chinese flying to the US. And also to basically increase the alert. It is true that it was after the World Health Organization declared this a global pandemic. But you know, the reaction was very quick, and to me, it shows that anything flies for the US. I mean, anything that can help the US contain China will be used for the US to contain China. That's what I mean. So in a way, it's probably going to accelerate the decoupling of the West from China, and you know, reshoring of even German activity out of China, etc. So in a way, it's a new. Sorry to say, it's a little bit of a dirty game, if I may say, because it's a pandemic, yeah? I mean, it's not something that you would use. I'm not saying it's done on purpose, but it's certainly handy for the US to isolate China. So we are indeed, to me, in some kind of Cold War with globalization characteristics, and this coronavirus puts it at the forefront, what it really means. So it's not really Chernobyl, because you can export it, but China is not allowed to export it. Not that it may want to export it, but the US is containing that export, if I may say, of that contagion, and in a way making it remain a China-only pandemic rather than a global pandemic.
And the question to you.
If I could just have 10 seconds on Chernobyl. It's a subject dear to my heart because I was based in the Soviet Union when the Chernobyl accident happened. And indeed, I was in Kiev the weekend the accident happened. So it's something that I've followed very closely ever since those days. The way Chernobyl is remembered is partly for accelerating the process of glasnost inside the Soviet Union, making Gorbachev think we just can't carry on being as secretive as this any longer. So if the question is, could the coronavirus do something to make the Chinese system less secretive? That's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer to it, but I mean, it might be worth watching out for. I think looking back, it didn't feel this quite so much in 1986, but by 1987, I think we did feel that the impact of Chernobyl on the internal politics of the Kremlin was quite significant. Now, the question about Boris Johnson and Brexit. I've known him a long, long time, ever since he was a journalist. And unlike some people who have this image of him as a sort of basically a kind of moderate, centrist type of conservative, I've actually never felt that. I've felt all along he's been quite hard line. He used to speak like this when he was a young man. So it doesn't surprise me at all that he gave a speech like this. I also think one has to keep in mind the fact that the parliamentary Conservative Party and the membership around the UK of the Conservative Party and the base of the party's electoral support, all these three things have changed very, very fundamentally since the referendum of 2016. It's become a much more strident England-based party with a harsher view of matters in the EU. The people who used to be very important figures in the party, like Michael Heseltine and Ken Clarke and Chris Patten, they've all gone. The party is now a hardline party that wants to, as far as possible, diverge from EU norms and standards. So I think one has to take it very seriously. Now, whether in practice over time you will end up with such a clear-cut radical divergence, I'm not so sure. Certainly by the end of this year, I wouldn't expect total clarity on that. I think probably you'll get a very narrow goods-based trade agreement. I mean, it'll be thin, not covering everything, leaving a lot still to be negotiated somehow. But I mean, it's unclear. But basically the question is, should you take him seriously? I think yes.
We are well over time, so I will leave my last question for the next conference in a year where we may be faced with even more instability to discuss. Thank you, my panelists, Tony Barber, Alicia Garcia Herrero, Sudha David-Wilp, and early on Professor Danuta Hübner. Thank you very much, and I will just remind you that we will conclude our conference with a panel on Polish politics in a few minutes. Thank you.